Hello, world, and welcome back to week 3 of World of World's DFS Building Blocks show. As always, I'm your host, John Daigle, joined by my friend in life, Hayden Winks, and this week, a special guest, hopefully someone that can help us steal a few signals here, none other than entrepreneur himself, Ben Gretsch. Ben, how's it going, buddy?
Pretty good, man. Glad to be on with you guys.
So let's talk a little bit about what you're doing right now, because formerly with CBS, and now you have gone your own way. With all due respect, I know you parted peacefully and everything, but you're doing your own thing now and starting Stealing Signals, a Substack, a mailing list that seems like they're jumping all over. Myself, I'm a subscriber as well.
Yeah, I mean, so really part of it was getting an opportunity to do some sports betting stuff that worked out pretty well. And then I didn't really know what I was going to do on the fantasy side. And so some of that was just dictated by the market, people reaching out to me saying they wanted to get Stealing Signals, and then some good advice from some people like Sal, who I spoke to this week. I don't know if you guys saw that, but there's a good interview there that kind of talked through that. And that's how I landed on this newsletter, idea. And I think it is a pretty good fit. I keep getting feedback that it's a good fit for Stealing Signals. So, that's where we're going with it. I kind of just played it by ear a little bit, and that's where we're at.
So give us a little sample, like what can people expect whenever they're reading Stealing Signals? Because they know our content, Hayden and I's at Roto World, between the waiver wire, between the fantasy usage model, the fantasy forecast, or the fantasy blueprint, as it's called now on Fridays. I just forgot for 1 second. They know what to expect from us and the shows. Like, what can they get whenever they're subscribing to Stealing Signals?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, there's one of the sayings that I use a lot is the concept of like teaching a man to fish, whatever, eat for a lifetime. And I know you guys are similar in that way, where we want to take people through our process. For me, yeah, I'm going game by game. I'm writing about every game. I'm writing all the things that I took notes on. I'm taking you through the process that I do. So it's basically me just doing my process and writing it out. I would do it anyway. I do it a lot more in depth because I am writing it and I get more out of it that way. And then people seem to enjoy reading through that. And I think even when I miss things, that I'm giving enough clues on the, teaching how to fish thing, that I get this feedback that's like, oh, you didn't mention this specific thing. I'm guessing you would lean this way on it. And usually the readers are right on point because they've kind of figured out what my process is. So I think it's both teaching someone to fish, but also teaching, giving them plenty of fish as well, because there's a lot of stats and a lot of specific information of what I think the signals and the noise are, and what's going to happen, and what trends we will see happen over the next several months.
It definitely sounds like a more intricate Discord. That's kind of like how I treat the waiver wire column as well. I'll write it, push it out by the afternoon. I jump in a waivers chat on Tuesday afternoon at 6 p.m. Eastern. And then afterwards, I spend time updating the column with what I retrieve from the chat, because they ask questions that I didn't even think about and diving into the data. So it helps that a ton. But before we jump into the slate, Hayden, how did week 2 in general treat you?
Well, just the second week, now you have I feel way more comfortable after like 2 weeks of data rather than just one, because a lot of it's like matchup dependent. Some game scripts just go off the rails. I think with 2 weeks, you're still kind of trying to figure things out a little bit, but you kind of have a good understanding of how offenses are going to be treated. Are they going to be up pace? Are they going to be slowing down? So I think that we now can really start focusing in on just the matchups aspect of it, and less so on like the team overarching ideas.
And that's why I'm really excited about this DFS slate in particular, as we're here to talk about, again, not the Sunday night game and not the Monday night game. We're talking about Sunday's main slate across sites. And it's because the last 2 weeks, I felt there was a lot of data to filter out and try and decide who was a contender and who's a pretender. But this week, I think I have a little more lean confidently into a concerted pool of players I like. That's why I'm really excited to talk about this with y'all. And remember, throughout this feature, we will be taking questions from the chat as well. So continue to get those in. But as we always do, let's start with, as Ben said, not a fish, but a fishing pole. And that's because we like to start with the decision point. And that is what we believe is the number one decision people are encountering whenever they're making DFS lineups this week. And we'll try and help each other and you solve that. So Ben, let's get yours first, what you've been running into.
Well, my biggest decision in this is on the GPP side, but just kind of trying to decide how heavy I want to be on the two really high total games. How heavy, and for me, it's Kyler and Russ more than Dak. So how heavy do I want to be on Kyler and Russ, knowing that they're going to be popular stacks, knowing that those games are going to probably shoot out, but there's obviously a lot of other games on the slate. So you have this decision, I think, between, are we sure that the top scoring stack is going to come from these two particular games that I'm looking at, the Cardinals game and the Cowboys and Seattle game, or do you take the field? And if you take the field, I mean, you're going to get lower ownership, but you also have a harder time hitting which one. So it's a tournament decision. And I keep finding myself just wanting a ton of Russ and Kyler. I really want to be on Russ right now. They're letting him cook. I really want to be on Kyler. His rushing yards per game is more than doubled this year. That upside is so high right now. And he hasn't even really hit the big passing game yet, but I think he's going to have some monster games coming up here pretty soon. So those are the two quarterbacks I want to be all over, even though they are going to be, widely owned.
And as you're mentioning that, I'm actually pulling up our DFS toolkit right now at rotoworld.com/NFL or /optimizer. And Kyler Murray is actually our top value, which is not shocking considering, as you mentioned, the number one and one of the top two highest totals of the week with the Cowboys in Seattle. That's also kind of why I like running it back with Marvin Jones, even though Golladay is going to be maybe on the field. Is there anyone in particular? Is it Marvin Jones that you like running back a potential Kyler stack with?
I've been doing more Hawkinson just because the Cardinals tight end, the Smiths flow chart.
Yeah.
And I love Hawkinson, but I do think Jones makes some sense. I hadn't really considered him a ton, but Golladay being out there probably means that Peterson's on him a little bit more, and Jones could be in a good spot as well.
Hayden, what about your decision point?
We're on the same wavelength. My big decision is how do you optimally get pieces of these game stacks when you're not stacking those games like in a lineup. So if I was stacking Kyler and DeAndre, which guys from the Cowboys game do I fit in that lineup without basically if you put in Amari Cooper in your Kyler Murray stack, that means like you're betting on Kyler and them outdoing the Cowboys stack. That's why I was kind of grabbing Zeke, hoping that Zeke gets all of the touchdowns in that game. You still get the over and the high total from that game without kind of cannibalizing yourself in your stack. So basically trying to how do you get pieces of these games and these totals when you're not actually stacking in that lineup? Does that make sense?
So, yeah, and it may be a rhetorical question you're asking, but have you dwindled it down to one particular piece you think will come in lower rostered and is the contrarian player to roster?
Well, it's not even so much that. Let's say if I was doing a Russ and Tyler Lockett stack, and I still think that the Cardinals is going to shoot out, I don't want to put DeAndre Hopkins in that because that means that Kyler Murray is going to be balling out too, and I'm competing with that. I'd rather go put Kenyon Drake in my lineup. Hopefully that Kenyon Drake scores the touchdowns in that game because he's going to be the only one scoring the fantasy points. And now you kind of got the best of both worlds in that situation. So I kind of like picking the running back when I'm not stacking it in that particular lineup.
That exact example is something I was going to mention later, but yeah, I love the Russ stacks with Kenyon Drake. I mean, I think that's a great way of playing it.
See, and my decision point also mentions these two games because they're the most focused on, except I want to highlight Chris Carson in particular, because if you don't play Russ and go with Kyler or Stafford or Dak, I think throwing Carson in there, who is the clear-cut number one back over Carlos Hyde, is still getting used in the passing game, 9 targets this year, I believe, and he's already had 2 receiving scores. So just to be heavily involved in the Russ cook mantra as well. Like, he seems to be a good leverage off the passing game while also being involved in the passing game. So I do just like trying to get contrarian with these two games while sprinkling in other players we're going to talk about here. But let's get to players we will have the most exposure towards as we continue to take questions from the chat. Go ahead and lead this one off again, Ben. Who's one player you're not getting off despite the ownership?
Well, Kyler and Russ for sure. I think at running back, because I'm going a little bit higher price with some stacks, I'm winding up with a lot of Miles Sanders and Jonathan Taylor, who are a little bit of a discount to like the really top end running backs. I mentioned Drake when I'm doing the Russ stacks. And I think, like those are like the main QBs and running backs. Receivers, I'm going to, and tight ends are going to be kind of stack dependent. I'm going to sprinkle around a lot. But I think one more that's interesting is the San Francisco running backs. Kittle's out again now. They have a backup quarterback. I kind of think they're going to try to run a ton. And I'm playing a little bit of Jeff Wilson and Jerick McKinnon in some lineups. Not like a ton, but I'm certainly, like, when you add up their ownership, I'm certainly kind of trying to get exposure to that backfield.
Hayden, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that Jeff Wilson's probably going to have a substantial role. He's not going to have the passing down role, but I would be pretty surprised if he wasn't the goal line back. And I just think that you want to take a stand with these guys, and I'd probably be a little underweight on Jerick McKinnon just because I'm not sure they're going to give him like 15, 20 touches coming off of his ACL injury if they don't trust the turf that they're playing on. So I think that Jeff Wilson between the two, I haven't looked at ownership between the two. I would guess that people are going to be all over Jerick McKinnon and that I would rather have Jeff Wilson, but I have to check that.
It's an interesting discussion point because, like, Jeff Wilson is one of the cheapies that could actually hit if we are not assuming Mike Davis is inserted as the Christian McCaffrey 1B. Like, if he doesn't take over the 90% role. I'm sure you've written about this at Stealing Signals, Ben. Like, any thoughts on that Mike Davis situation?
Yeah, Davis, 7 of his 8 receptions. Everyone loves the passing down work. Obviously, me, most of all, I've always loved pass catching running backs and have this high value touch stat that's basically based around them. So he catches 8 passes last week, and I think when you look at the box score, you get really excited about that. 7 of those 8 catches came in the final 2 drives. For anyone who was actually watching the game, it was all a product of Tampa Bay playing way off and Bridgewater just checking down underneath, pass after pass after pass, 2 yards. Sitting down 2 yards behind the line of scrimmage, catching a pass, turning and running for 5 yards, gaining 7 yards. And he racked up 7 catches. And I think people are looking at that and going, oh, he's going to have this Christian McCaffrey type receiving role. I'm not sure I'm buying that. Curtis Samuel has played a lot closer to the line of scrimmage this year. He had 4 rush attempts before McCaffrey got hurt. So It wouldn't surprise me if they use Samuel in a little bit of the McCaffrey type role in the backfield and in the passing game. And Davis is kind of a between the tackles grinder a little bit. I'm not looking at his 8 receptions as like some big positive sign that I think it is in the box score, immediately when you look at that.
I hope this doesn't ruin anyone's momentum, but I do want to talk about this running back situation as well, because Bucks fan asks, how do we feel about Derrick Henry as a GPP running back this week? And I got to say, I absolutely love him. I'm going to pull up again our projections here at the RotoWorld DFS toolkit as I'm trying to produce and share screen. And I'm not going to share the entire, but as you see here on top of running back projections, Derrick Henry is here. And that's not the only reason I love him, however, but that is one reason. And it's because he still leads the league, or is tied with Josh Jacobs for the league lead in touches among running backs. The difference is the touchdowns haven't been there. And that's literally the only variance here. And to be in a sneaky shootout, if the Vikings can carry their own weight. I understand it's only 2 players, Dalvin Cook and Adam Thielen, who we are going to talk about later. But if the Vikings can do anything on offense at all, like, I do think it's still a good game script for Derrick Henry, who is outpacing his career rate in touches, even though Darrington Evans does come back this week. So me, honestly, I love Derrick Henry this week. Hayden, any thoughts?
Yeah, through 2 weeks, he's the RB7 in fantasy usage. He has not lived up to those expectations at all. So those will be regressing positively. So yeah, I'm fine with it. I think the one problem that you run into here is that you're kind of getting away from the biggest totals of the week. I think that the Titans are projected for 25.5 points, but Ryan Tannehill has been so good. He's second in passing EPA per dropback right now. I think that the offense could be a little more pass heavy than people give it credit for, just because Tannehill's been so good. But I mean, you can never go wrong. Derrick Henry's a couple of plays away from a monster game. So in a GPP, why not?
Is there anything you've noticed, Ben, from the Titans offense in general? Because I still think they're one of the wildest regression candidates who never seem to regress. They're just like, instead being super efficient, and we just can't pin them week to week.
Yeah, no, I don't have any explanation for that or any reason for that. I do. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of discussion of their play action game, and they do lean heavily on the play action in the passing game, which helps the passing efficiency. But I generally don't have a like a broad level, explanation for that. I know that, a few of Tannehill's touchdowns have been short area play action plays where guys have just gotten wide open. Tight ends have snuck out wide open. But obviously this offense flows and runs through Henry. He's been running a decent number of routes so far this year. I am a little bit concerned about the Evans activation. I mean, I don't think it's like he's going to cut into Henry's work a ton, but they right after the draft, they praised his pass blocking and all these things. He had a bad camp. So, I wouldn't expect him to come in and take a ton of passing downs work in his first game, but it's something to watch because Henry has been running a few more routes and still not really seeing huge receiving work. And so there is a little bit of a limitation there if he's not running efficiently, right? But they have a massive advantage on the offensive line this week as well. So you got to like Henry. I'm with you on him for sure.
And the difference this week for DFS in particular, before we get to Hayden's highest roster player, is that there's no Zeke or there's no McCaffrey or Barkley, right? So it's literally Zeke and Henry at the top, unless you get contrarian with Dalvin Cook. So that's why I think that's really interesting that Henry will probably carry higher ownership, even though people may not agree with his outlook, just because he's one of the stronger options, one of the only stronger options priced over 8K. Hayden, what about your highest roster player this week?
Yeah, and this is pretty chalky, but I think it's going to end up being Miles Sanders just because he's priced too cheap, down at 6,400. He played 82% of the snaps. They have offensive line problems, but they have Lane Johnson back, and the Bengals are going to be missing Geno Atkins and I believe Mike Daniels as well. He's going to get 20 touches or at least 20 touches in general, and the Bengals offense or defense just cannot rush the passer. I think that the Eagles offense should get back on the right track this week, and I think that he is going to be the driving force behind that.
Any thoughts on the Eagles offense in particular, Ben?
I agree with everything that Hayden said. I mean, obviously their offensive line has been a major issue, right? But they were getting the ball out a little bit earlier last week, and Winston take as many hits. I think he got sacked 0 times after getting sacked 8 times in week 1. But not his average throw depth was a lot lower. He wasn't pushing the ball down the field. Tons of air yards in week 1 for this offense, and then none last week. A lot of underneath passing. But yeah, the Bengals don't rush the passer a lot. This is a good spot for them. This is a game that I kind of like. I like the Bengals side of it too, which we can get to a little bit later. But I am hopeful that the Eagles finally figure it out a little bit on offense this week.
Yeah, so my thing with this offense is that I actually like coming off Miles Sanders just to get contrarian and throwing Carson Wentz, Zach Ertz, and Deshaun Jackson in there to gain leverage off Miles Sanders. Because the Eagles, I think someone had mentioned in the chat earlier. Oh, yeah, here we go. Let's find this. Why are the Eagles garbage, man? Well, it's because Carson Wentz has been bad, but also they've just played tougher defenses, and the Bengals are the perfect get-right spot. Even Baker Mayfield got right against them. So I think the Eagles' offense in particular will find themselves open often. And although I do love Sanders this week, he's a top 5 running back and season long for me, I need to find a way to get off of him because he's going to be one of the higher rostered players. And thus for tournaments, not for cash, for tournaments, Wentz, Jackson, Ertz for me, and then running it back with likely Aj Green, unfortunately, just because the targets and the air yards are there.
Unfortunately.
I mean, the numbers point to positive regression.
Yeah.
The knees point to being washed. So we'll find out which one is true. Also, Drew Sample, just you come in late in the game and then average or see a 35% target share in the few possessions without Uzoma, and also lead that team with 4 red zone targets. And the Eagles, as we know, this season have been blown up by tight ends so far in Logan Thomas and Tyler Higbee. So Sample's also like a sneaky way if you want to go Wentz Wentz Sanders to keep the exposure to Sanders and Deshaun Jackson, and then put Sample in the tight end slot. It's another way I don't mind for tournaments as well. But to speak on a player we've already talked about, my highest rostered is Kenyon Drake, because I think it's an absolute smash spot for him in a total that not only do I think will go over 55 points, but rival the Cowboys over. The Lions have allowed the most rushing yards per attempt, and the highest rate of 10-plus yard carries to opposing running backs. and the most yards per attempt, 7.2, to running backs through the air. So it's just a position they're not equipped to stop at all. And Drake is still the workhorse in that team, out touching Chase Edmonds, out carrying Chase Edmonds 36-9. So I still absolutely love Drake, and I love Drake in this spot. And I hope it's also good leverage off of Kyler Murray, since we assume that Kyler Murray is going to be one of the higher rostered players on the entire slate.
Yeah, with Kenyon Drake, he has a 35% touch share when the Cardinals have a lead, and that's pretty dang high if you look across the NFL. So we think that the Cardinals are going to lead or have a big lead. Kenyon Drake's going to be out there. And I mean, this rushing scheme is so good. When you have Kyler out in shotgun and basically the edge defenders have no idea which way to go, and Kenyon Drake gets to run outside a lot. So I think that this offense is going to really blow up. And Kenyon Drake, we haven't seen it totally yet, but I think that a huge game's in store in these next couple of weeks, and why not this week?
And then Jabber13 has a big picture question here. Someone just dabbling in DFS, possible to still bid and edge and be profitable, or is the player pool too strong given the availability of resources? And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on this one, Ben, but for me, it is, I still think cash games, head-to-heads, and simply being 1v1 and 2v2 are still super profitable if you're putting in the work. I don't think you have to worry about the edge whatsoever. The edge is still absolutely there. And for tournaments, for me, remember that every bit of data is still data to leverage. And so when you listen to DFS shows and podcasts and you hear them talk about the same player, just know like that is also data to leverage and find a way to get off of those players and be contrarian. Because if everyone's going in one direction, like, you need to diversify yourself. You need to be unique. So you should be going the opposite direction. So I think that's how you should be listening to even this show, just taking the players that we like and knowing that the rest of the industry, when we talk about how high they'll be rostered, are also going to be like heavily talked about in other shows, just trying to figure out ways off of that.
Yeah, I mean, the question is kind of contradictory in a certain way, because it says, is there too much variance or is the player pool too strong given the availability of resources? But the point you just made is like, is if everybody knows what's going to happen, or that's the implication of there's so many resources out there, we're all building such great lineups. If everyone's right on the same thing, then variance doesn't really apply here, right? So you're kind of being contradictory there, and I think that's kind of the point that you just made, is that there is a lot of resources out there. There is a lot of information to be consumed, but you can still take advantage of the variance that's out there, especially right now. I mean, you mentioned at the top of the show, I love where we're at, and Hayden, you mentioned love having 2 weeks of data. This is like my favorite slate of the year right now. We have some trends that people really, really love and want to buy into that I don't agree with. We have things that we haven't seen yet that I think are going to happen in the next few weeks. There's still plenty of stones left to be unturned in the 2020 season, and plenty of things that you can fade and just be like, that's not something I'm buying. It's just a 2-week sample. So this is a really fun time, I think, to be building DFS lineups, and there's plenty of room with the variance that does exist in NFL DFS to still be building profitable lineups.
I think another variance type player in this slate, since we're all looking for the cheapies and Mike Davis and potentially Jeff Wilson and Jarrett McKinnon, is actually this situation from Tyler Brantley, and it's Austin Eckler or Joshua Kelly for starting running back. Hayden, do you have a lean on one or the other?
Well, I think their roles are pretty defined, in my opinion. I think that Eckler probably is going to end up with more touches still, and he's going to get the receiving work over Joshua Kelly. And then Joshua Kelly has a potential to go in there and sneak for goal line touchdowns, plus see probably around 15 carries himself. We've seen the Panthers get run over, so I think that both of them have upside. I still think that Eckler is the person you got to project for more points, but the gap isn't as crazy as we thought it was going to be going into the season. That's for dang sure.
Any other additional thoughts, Ben?
No, not really. I think you hit it right. I'm worried that I don't have enough of them, but I'm kind of staying away from it a little bit. I think this game might be, I'm hoping that this game is not super entertaining because I'm not playing a lot of guys in that game.
I love your professional segue, because now we're actually going to get into who we are fading, who players we are not taking part in GPPs because we don't think they'll pay off their salary. So go ahead. Let's start with Ben.
Well, I don't know if it's because I don't think he's like they're going to take pay off their salary, but I'm not getting a lot of Zeke this week, and I don't like that. But I do think as a road underdog, 5-point road underdog, I'm trusting Seattle and Russ to continue to Seattle to continue to let Russ cook, and Russ to continue to cook, and probably Russ continuing to be great is the easier side of that to project than whether Seattle will even let him be great, which seems backwards, but. I think that could create some negative script. Zeke's been very involved in the passing game as well, but at his price tag and with some of the options we have at running back that are a little bit cheaper, I'm just not getting him into a lot of lineups and a little bit concerned about that. Mike Davis is another one that's going to be probably reasonably highly owned, and he's another guy that, I mentioned the 7 receptions on the final 2 drives, and he's another running back that I'm fading the public on a little bit.
Is there a cheap running back, Hayden, since we've already mentioned Mike Davis and Jeff Wilson? Is there anyone else that you've that has caught your eye in this slate?
Not really. I just think that there's so much value with the Miles Sanders, Jonathan Taylor tier already that I don't really feel like I'm like pressured into finding someone that's super cheap just because we're not spending up on a Christian McCaffrey for 10K. That I think that I don't feel like I'm pressed for salary as much as I was in previous weeks. I'm forcing myself into like a 4K, 5K running back.
Steve Boynton has a suggestion. The great Steve Boynton, who tunes into most shows of ours.
It's a good one.
Devin Singletary.
I was just going to say him.
Let's hear it.
Steve.
Let's hear it. What draws you to
Zach
Devin
Moss
Singletary?
Is out. Yeah, Zach Moss is out. I think this game has some sneaky shootout potential. Singletary's been pretty involved in the passing game so far. We know Allen's been playing a lot better. I think Goff is sort of interesting. The Rams have looked a lot better on offense than they did, at least in the early part of 2019, right? I think we can pretty much say we're only through 2 weeks, but I feel confident saying that McVay's figured out some of the things where the league figured him out a little bit after the Super Bowl the prior year. And it was the Patriots had the blueprint on the Rams, and they struggled early last year. They got some things figured out late last year. It wasn't just Tyler Higbee who was great in the last 5 games. Their passing game was a lot better. Goff threw at least 280 yards and 2 touchdowns in each of those 5 games. And that's carried over to this year. He's been very efficient to start the year. I think the Rams are going to be a good offense now going forward, that McVay has figured enough stuff out, and the Bills are too. The Bills, we've seen some positive things from the Bills. So this game can shoot out a little bit, and that's a guy that is too cheap because Moss is out. He's probably going to have most of the touches in the backfield in a game that could be a little bit higher scoring.
I actually still have a lot of questions about the Rams defense too, and they could be studly. I don't know, but the big factor is, was the Cowboys offense lost in week 1 because of the Rams or because it was their first game under Mike McCarthy? Because we know the Eagles have looked bad through 2 games. So I don't attribute that to the Rams at all. So if it was just the Cowboys being lost, that means we can still attack this Rams defense. And we know Josh Allen can break the code anyways, even if it's a good defense. Like he can single-handedly score points on his own. And if that's the case, we should assume more red zone opportunities. And if that's the case, then it would lead us back to Singletary. So yeah, I do like that play a lot. Hayden, what about your number 1 fade against the public this weekend?
I think it's going to be Kenny Golladay, and I hope he does play. He basically admitted that he's not at 100%, and I think that he's going to have a lot of ownership in this game just because everybody wants pieces of this game, and I do too. I would just rather run it back with Marvin Jones, who's just a couple $100 cheaper than Kenny Golladay. TJ Hawkinson has not been involved as much as I thought. A 12% target share, tight end 23 fantasy usage. So I think that Marvin Jones is the guy that I would prefer to be running it back with. And maybe DeAndre Swift, if we can kind of predict a breakout game as the passing down back. But I think that I want to be putting my eggs in the Marvin Jones basket at probably half the ownership compared to Kenny Golladay, especially if he's not 100%.
Why I love this game in particular, and I continue crediting this stat to Sharp Football's Rich Rebar because he's the one who pointed it out to me when we were talking, and that is that Matthew Stafford's deep ball rate has been sliced in half in the first 2 games without Kenny Golladay. 20% last year in his 8 games he started, and 10% this year. And so if Golladay is even available, that's why I like Marvin Jones. That's why I like TJ Hawkinson. That's why I like the Lions to cover 6 points and to potentially even upset the Cardinals. It's because the Lions offense will be completely new and will be back to being explosive if Galladay's out there. So yeah, I love the Lions offense this weekend. And then I talked about him last week, but I guess I got to go back for a different reason. That's because not in cash games again, but in tournaments, I'm fading Deontay Johnson. I hate myself, 1. And 2, because I think James Conner is the play there. Everyone still is so scared to roster James Conner, despite the fact that in 5 quarters together now where they have been healthy, he's out-carried Benny Snell 22-5. He's out-targeted Benny Snell 5-2, and then he has handled every single touch inside of the 5-yard line. Like James Conner is clearly the number 1 back in that backfield, and we know the Texans' rush defense is basically a copy of the Panthers this year. Like they're even worse across the board. So I do think it's a sneaky way to gain ownership towards a game that if Will Fuller and Deshaun Watson happen to carry their weight, like we could see a lot of usage for James Conner.
Yeah.
And if both of you are scared to play him, that's totally okay too. All right.
No, he's fine. I think he's going to project well. I think he had like RB 13 fantasy usage in my model, and I think that's totally in line with projections for this week. So I think that he's going to be probably pretty owned. And we've seen the Steelers offense. The Steelers offense is different because they're not throwing the ball as deep as often. They're kind of running the ball a little bit more than we've seen before. Big Ben's getting the ball out quicker, but I think that James Conner still is the guy. We saw it last week. Benny Snell's just simply not involved in the offense right now. So I think go back to that while people are still a little bit nervous.
I would say, though, for everything you said that I agree with, I'm still probably not going to play a lot of them because I am whatever if you want to call it being afraid of it, then yeah, that's what it is. But there's a lot of running backs in that range that I like, and I don't really want to click James Conner's name, so I'm not doing it a whole lot.
So like the big picture thought is that you should always take on risk, right? Because what you are feeling is what everyone's feeling when making lineups, and thus you should leverage. Like we always talk about like leveraging exposure and like so swapping off players, but that also means emotion. So like I'm also taking everyone's emotions and leveraging it against them the entire time. Having said that, like I've lost all emotion in my heart doing that for 5 years now. So I'm just like taking all the fear and don't care anymore. So I'll probably be overweight with James Conner, unfortunately. So behind the scenes, I should say, getting ready for this segment, I have been locking in players to the RotoWorld Toolkit Optimizer. I have Miles Sanders, Kenyon Drake, and Russell Wilson, who we already said we want our exposure towards. But now I'm going to add in our tournament pivots because we are going to talk about our favorite darts for large entry tournaments, the recreational $3, $9 fields, $10 fields that everyone likes to play. So go ahead, Ben. Let's hear your tournament dart in those large entry fields.
Yeah, it's so I think at this point in the year, we talked about we're early in the year, and this is going to get back to the big Twitter discussion last night about Laviska Shenault. And I'm going to cape so hard for the fact that he was not a bad play, that everyone gets really upset when a player who has not yet broken out doesn't do something that we expect or we're talking about or saying will happen. But if an established guy has a bad day, it's just like, oh yeah, DeAndre Hopkins had a bad day. We've seen him do it before. He wasn't a bad play last night, Laviska Shenault. And I think the same logic goes to trying to find guys. When you're looking for a milli maker dart or what have you, you're looking for somebody who is going to dramatically outproduce expectations. I think that can happen with veterans, obviously, but I think it's a lot easier to catch that lightning in a bottle when you're looking at a young guy who's showing us something for the first time that we didn't necessarily know he had or possessed or the field didn't know. So I have 2 rookies that I think are great plays this week in large field tournaments. KJ Hamler, who I think everyone is kind of undervaluing a little bit because of Jerry Jeudy. KJ Hamler was a second-round pick, phenomenal prospect profile. He missed week 1. He played last week, 7 targets, 116 air yards. Jeff Driscoll loves the YOLO ball, loves to push it down the field, and Hamler's got the ability to push the ball, to push the defense vertically. And obviously, Cortland Sutton's out. They need that. Jerry Jeudy's a game-time decision now, but also just broadly, I think people think that the gap between Jeudy and Hamler is a lot wider than it probably is. It would not be that surprising if Hamler was better than Jeudy this year. It wouldn't be that surprising for a second-round receiver with his type of profile to be better than a first-round receiver as a rookie with the opportunity presented to both of them. So I think Hamler's going way overlooked. Just generally, he was a big waiver target this week, but somebody that I think in large field tournaments on DraftKings, he's min price. I haven't actually looked over at FanDuel yet, but he's 3,000. I mean, he makes a lot of these stacks and the pricing work if you want to bet on him. The other one's Antonio Gibson, snaps up from 26% to 65% last week. He crushed everyone who played him in DFS in week 1. Last week, no one played him, and he wasn't like that great, but his role changed completely. Peyton Barber completely out of the offense. Gibson's routes went from 22% of dropbacks to 53% of dropbacks. J.D. McKissick's routes went from 58% down to 29%. Basically, they flipped. Now Gibson's running way more routes in week 2 from what we saw in week 1. He's playing way more snaps and playing the role that Peyton Barber took over in the second half of week 1. So now we have this workhorse that burned everybody in week 1, and nobody probably wants to play him again. And not a great team total or anything, but Gibson's another guy that I think you can definitely mix in and probably will still be low ownership.
It's interesting for Hamler because, well, the term free square is thrown around far too often anyways. But Hamler is, as you said, stone minimum on DraftKings. And while I don't, there's clearly the opportunity and the chance he doesn't get there, so he's not necessarily a free square. I mean, he's the speed threat who hits on one catch, and Jeff Driscoll is just a gunslinger. That's all he is. He just throws downfield and runs around and plays as if he's trying to win every single play. There is no check down in his life force. And so that's why I kind of like Hamler playing with Driscoll and not Drew Lock in particular. So I'm actually going to take Hamler for this lineup we're building here and over Antonio Gibson, even though both players are optimal on DraftKings since we get the PPR points there, whereas FanDuel, we're only looking for touchdowns. Hayden, what about you for a large entry tournament player?
KJ Hamler was the first name I wrote down. He popped in my model. I wrote him up as a rebound candidate just because he had 116 air yards, 7 targets, and like you guys said, a complete freak athlete. I mean, if he would have ran at the combine, everybody would know who he is. I'm not sure how many NFL fans really know who KJ Hamler is, and I think that he has a chance to break off a big play, and he doesn't even really need one to be in a million-making lineup. The other guy I would say is kind of Russell Gage, who is still priced way, way, way down. His target share, I think, is here to stay in the short term because Julio Jones is just simply not right now. And I think that Russell Gage, I believe at like 5,100, somewhere around there. I think he makes a lot of sense just on a per target basis. The Falcons are just going to be top 3, top 5 in pass attempts basically every single week. And at home here, I think that he could pay off. And nobody wants to click Russell Gage's name just because it's Russell Gage.
That's why he's a great play, because nobody wants to click Russell Gage.
And to average 7.9 targets per game over his last 11 contests since the team traded Mohamed Sanu, I wasn't buying Russell Gage week 1 either. I was down on him in the waiver wires column, just thought he was a jag. And then it was clear that his opportunity is here to stay. I mean, he's been successful despite 2 Calvin Ridley fireworks shows and Hayden Hurst exploding in week 2. And yet Russell Gage's opportunity is still surviving. So he's clearly a part of that offense. So yeah, I'm fine with locking him on DK for 5,100. And then mine is, this is where I like to get contrarian and just finding these sure things that aren't going to be rostered at all. And I do like Adam Thielen this week a ton. The 33% target share isn't going anywhere. Literally all you need is for them to fall behind, which there's a terrific chance they do, run more plays, which there's a terrific chance they do since they can historically not keep up running 50, just over 50 plays per game. And then if the Titans continue to run their offense the way they have, and just Ryan Tannehill still being more efficient, and that not even going to regress this week as well, then that means the tempo is also uptick for the Vikings offense. So I think the 33% target share is locked in, and I want to play that type of player.
Big agree with this. I think Thielen's going to have some monster weeks because there's no competition for targets. And like you said, Daigle, 96 plays through 2 weeks. The second closest, 115. And that's the Jets. The Jets have the second worst play volume. That's 20 plays higher than the Vikings. There's no way that's going to keep up. The Vikings are going to run more plays, and Thielen's going to really start eating soon.
So with that, I want to lock these players in, and I'm going to hit optimize. And I don't have the Whammies theme song right now, but let's see what happens. Fingers crossed it doesn't explode.
Hopefully Tyler Lockett.
You got to stack Wilson with somebody.
I don't know if it's prepared for KJ Hamler and Russell Gage in the same lineup. Actually, it is prepared. So we ran back. Let's see. It paid up for Zach Ertz, DeAndre Hopkins, and then went down on defense with the Panthers.
But we have Wilson here and Drake in this lineup, so Hopkins doesn't make a lot of sense. I think probably you want to flip that to a Seattle receiver, but that's a pretty decent lineup.
Exactly. That's why we want to talk about it too. So we take those players out. You can't keep Russ, but most likely you would need to, rather than paying up for Hopkins at receiver, we'd probably drop Gage or Hamler.
Yeah, get rid of Gage.
Yeah, we drop Gage or Hamler. We would likely go up to DK or Lockett. Do you have a preference, Ben?
Oh, man. I was a Lockett preseason guy, but DK has looked so good, man. He's the 1 week touchdown, spike play. Lockett obviously has the massive efficiency potential. I like Lockett more. I probably click Lockett myself more than I click Metcalf, but Metcalf's the guy that has that massive ceiling, it feels like.
And then I'm running it once more, and then it still shoots out Zach Ertz, which, again, I love playing Zach Ertz. That's fine. It just traded wide receivers. No big deal. All right. Well, with that, let's go ahead and get to the last segment here, as we will continue taking quotes or questions from the chat, and that is our favorite off-the-radar stack. So this doesn't have to necessarily be an offense no one's talking about. It can be a unique way to gain exposure to an offense we all like. For instance, like Miles Sanders, Carson Wentz, and Zach Ertz. So go ahead, Hayden. Let's lead off with your offensive stack.
Well, I think there's some reasons to go with like Jared Goff with either Cooper Kupp or Robert Woods. I think Robert Woods has the more bankable volume, but Cooper Kupp has the easier matchup of the two. And I think that this game has a lot of shootout potential just because both of these play callers are awesome. And I'm not sure people fully understand that quite yet. The other ones I have written down are Cam Newton with Julian Edelman, just because Julian Edelman has a 52% air yard share. He's the go-to guy. So if the Patriots are going to get there, it's going to be just because of those two guys. And I think you can run it back with Darren Waller, no Henry Ruggs. I don't think that the Raiders are just going to sit there and be able to run the ball 25 times. I think that Darren Waller is going to be force-fed targets like he had last Monday. So I think that the Cam Newton, Julian Edelman, Darren Waller run it back stack is going to have basically zero ownership, and you're capturing all of the upside in that game.
And what about your stack, Ben?
So I had Goff too as I wrote him down as like off the radar, then brain expanding, and then galaxy brain. And so Goff was my middle one. But my issue with Goff, I actually want to pass it back to Hayden for a sec. This is what I'm struggling with him, because I like the play, but he doesn't run a lot, right? He had 4 games of at least 370 passing yards last year, a 500-yard game. That's a quarter of his games where he threw up the high end of the 300 yards and was pushing 400 yards. He certainly has the pass volume upside. But if that game shoots out, isn't Josh Allen the quarter? Like, how does Goff outscore Josh Allen? That's the thing that I'm struggling with. What are your thoughts on that?
No, that is a good point. I think it's just if you're going to get pieces of the Dallas game and stuff, that I think probably saving the $1,000 or whatever the difference between the two is. This would also be factoring in that like maybe Darrell Henderson just doesn't get any goal line opportunities, and it's just you get lucky with Jared Goff. I mean, the one thing is both of these offenses are top 5 in play action rate, and they have just so many weapons, and they kind of spread the ball around. So it's going to be kind of hard to pinpoint who's going to get the workload. Like maybe this is like a John Brown game instead of a Stephon Diggs game. But I feel like I just like the over in this game in general, and I feel like I want just to try to at least figure it out.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. So my like off the radar one,
You're smiling, so it means it's going to be really off the radar.
My smallest brain one is Joe Burrow, Aj Green. I think that's going to be an up-tempo game. We like a couple Eagles guys. It's easy to bring back with Sanders or somebody. Burrow is slinging it around. He is mobile. He's got upside. And you guys can hate on Aj Green all you want. Everyone's convinced that he's completely washed. Aj Green was not a guy who won on elite athleticism. I wrote about this in Signals. This is just my little film watching opinion. But I went back and watched all his targets this week. I didn't see that different of a guy from what I remembered when Aj Green was at his peak. That guy won on body control. I called him Kenny Golladay before Kenny Golladay, or does some of the things that DeAndre Hopkins does. I watched all those targets. Yeah, a lot of them were uncatchable, which people talked about. A lot of them were just near misses. He's a little rusty. He's certainly not the same player. He's not as explosive or any of those things. I can see why people are saying he's dusty, but that type of volume that he's been getting in the last couple of weeks, I think people are crazy to completely just write him off as if he's not going to get a little bit into game shape a couple of games into the season and start to make some plays and start to position his body well enough to bring in some of these catches, because I just did not see that different of an AJ Green when I went back and watched it. So Burrow Green, I think, is a really fun one with some Eagles bringing back like Sanders. We talked about the Goff and Allen ones. That's like Goff's a little bit of a brain expanding one, I think, because he doesn't have any rushing ability, and you have to win a big GPP, you're going to have him outscore Allen in a game where both of them are producing. Both offenses are producing, and Allen has the rushing value. And with Zach Moss out, he probably has more rush TD equity than usual. So that's a tough one. The Galaxy brain play, though, the one where
we're
really
going Inception levels deep here.
Jeff Driscoll and KJ Hamler.
Oh, no.
Jeff Driscoll is so fun. The guy he's athletic, he scrambles, he runs, and he puts the ball down the field. Those are the things that I look at for quarterback upside: mobility and a willingness to push the ball down the field so you can add a lot of pass volume. He gets Tampa Bay. I think Brady was frustrated after some of those drop touchdowns, is going to want to put some stats out there. It would not surprise me at all if Brady is big in the stat book this week as well, and throws a couple of first half touchdowns and gets himself on the board, because he hasn't been necessarily great through 2 weeks and has been hearing some stuff, some chirping, and that puts Driscoll in this come from behind situation. He runs for 50, 60 yards. He throws for 280 yards, gets 3 total touchdowns, 2 of them to Hamler. There's your GPP winner.
He came in for 3 quarters and finished with the 3rd highest deep ball rate in the league last week, because that's, like I said, that's what he does. And that's why I also think, for the bettors out there, I said on the Roto World preview podcast that I thought Tampa Bay would run away. And the more I've thought about it the past 24 hours, I do think Driscoll throws a wrench in there. And the Broncos have been better than we think. Like it was the Connor, the sloppy 59-yard run that helped the Steelers get over the top and cover. But like the Broncos were in that game the entire time. And so I think they're just better than we perceive them to be, because Fangio, like Vrabel's defense, like it never pops, right? It's never high in DVOA, but he just outright coaches them up. Like he's the most football guy ever. And they're just always going to be in there because he knows where the player should be. So yeah, I kind of like the Broncos to cover that game. And if that's the case, it would likely be Hamler, and Melvin Gordon's another sneaky one who, without Phillip Lindsay, is going to again see all the touches, 21-3 over Royce Freeman, I believe, last week. So like Melvin Gordon's another usage-based back I don't mind pivoting to. And mine is, we've talked about the game a lot, but I like Stafford, Marvin Jones, and Kenny Golladay, and running it back with Kenyon Drake, because I want Drake everywhere. I know Galladay's coming to this game injured, but we've played this too long, between James Conner last week, between Tyreek Hill last year, between all the NBA DFS slates in between, to like when a player is even 75%, like even if he's limited, a player with Galladay's target, how he gets his targets, I should say, just to help lead the league, for instance, last year in 20+ yard looks in the 8 games Stafford played. Even if Galladay's limited, his opportunity, if we're only weighing his ceiling, it's still much higher than most of the players priced at his range. So I'm totally fine running him out there, hoping for 80 yards and a touchdown, adding Marvin Jones in there, and then hoping that game shoots out.
Yeah, I think that long term, and probably this game as well, I think the Lions are just a buy in general. We're going to see this offense get back to where they were in the first half of last season. I think that they're still trying to figure things out. Their right tackle's been in and out of the lineup, and just their defense has been so bad. They seem out of rhythm, and I think Kenny Golladay is probably the missing ingredient for this long term. I still really like Marvin Jones over Golladay just for GPPs in general, but Kenny Golladay unlocks this offense. So I think that season long, you want to buy these guys. And I think in this game environment, this is why we were talking about the Cardinals, is because we think that they're going to have to keep airing it out to DeAndre. Kyler's going to have to keep running. Kenyon Drake's in a good spot, just because we think that the Lions could actually keep up to some degree.
And with that, Ben, it was truly a pleasure to speak with you on football rather than watching you do karaoke in Nashville. And if you can, go ahead and tell the people where they can find you.
Yeah, bengretch.substack.com is the Stealing Signals newsletter. Comes out on Mondays and Tuesdays. It's like a fancy-focused recap, game by game. Also at Odds Checker, I'll be writing NFL betting articles every week, about 4 of them a week. So you can check me out there as well.
Hayden, what can the people find from you this week?
2 columns, fantasy usage column. It has a ton of data. I'm going to add more of it. I'm going to have a garbage time filter to see how many % of the touches come in garbage time, so we can kind
Jordan Akins is going to be the highest on the list every single week.
And I kind of thought of this with this Mike Davis nugget, like just filter out some of these things. So there's a bunch of data that's going to be in that one. And then my main column of the week is the fantasy blueprint. That's game by game, team by team, player by player, with all the charts, data, and news nuggets that you need.
And then, of course, if you want to access the toolkit we used on the show, dfs.rotoworld.com. You can also go to rotoworld.com/edge and use the code Daigle10, not Winks10, because Daigle10 is better, to get a discount. And we will be back on Sunday morning, the same exact location you're watching here, for a start-sit show. So again, Ben, thank you. Hayden, next week. Everyone else, same time next week.